Any surprises in the positive or negative direction for the Bears roster for you?
As I suspected, anything that fell into the category of surprise or, something like that, how much does it really matter, I guess? We're talking about the last few guys on a roster that on the back end probably isn't going to be terribly talented. But I will tell you the one guy that Jalen Jones, the cornerback who I had to look at it 3 times. I'm like, did Jalen Jones make the team? Because he was just somebody that, I'll be quite honest, I didn't write down in my notebook a lot during camp, either good or bad. And that's probably an indication that he was just consistent. So, as what looks like the 7th cornerback on the roster, I don't know how much he's really going to be a factor early on in the season, but the undrafted rookie must have done something that the Bears liked.
I've got him 6th, I believe, 11 DBs, so 6 corners and 5 safeties.
With DeAndre Houston Carson, who's done some of both.
Right, but, it's interesting. Certain names like that, I wonder, Adam, if we believe that they're going to pick up a couple of guys who got cut from other teams, some of these on the 53, they have in mind as, well, we could always part with this. Like if they love a corner who somebody else cuts, maybe Jalen Jones is in trouble, right? There's probably a few guys here like that.
Yeah, that's a fair point, and you're right. It is 6 corners. I still had Tavon Young listed, who, of course, went on injured reserve. That was, I think, just looking at surprises, just sort of the fact that in the offseason, we were figuring that Tavon Young and Thomas Graham Jr. would really highly factor into potentially starting in that nickel corner spot. And now they're both not on the initial 53-man roster. I guess that's where I look at, especially at that position, sort of a surprise. But yeah, the one thing to keep in mind here as this roster turnover happens is sometimes you might think you can sneak a guy to the practice squad after this initial wave, because there's this huge waiver wire that's going to go on till 11 a.m. tomorrow, and some guys are going to get claimed. Of course, if you claim a guy, he's got to go on your 53, and so sometimes after the dust settles, it can be a little bit easier, a day or two from then you cut a guy and get him to your practice squad a little bit later. So a lot of this is still in flux and will continue to be.
Mario Edwards Jr., a mild surprise to me. Bears defensive line even deeper than I had given it credit for?
Yeah, I was just looking at the D-line, and I sort of suspected this would be the case, but when you look at it, I like the D-line. I think it's one of the strengths on this team in terms of positional groups on this entire roster. So they end up keeping 4 defensive ends and 4 defensive tackles. And quite frankly, guys, I like them all. Of course, the defensive ends, you have a mix of proven guys. Robert Quinn at the top of the list. Al-Quadin Muhammad's proven in this defense and has really looked strong in the preseason. And then you have guys like Travis Gibson, who had a really good breakout year last year, maybe can take it to the next level this year, depending on how he ends up fitting in the scheme. And then you kind of have your raw, hopeful upside guy in Dominique Robinson. But then even with the defensive tackles, again, sort of the same mixture. You have proven veterans. Well, I say proven. Justin Jones has to stay a little bit healthier.
Yeah, he's a veteran.
He's a veteran. I like Angelo Blackson. I thought he was quietly very good for the Bears last year on that line. And Kairos Tonga, I thought was awesome for the Bears last year. I just didn't know how he would transition to a 4-3 defense and 1 gapping instead of 2 gapping, but he looks great. He looks fine. And then Mike Pennell Jr. also makes it, and he's got some experience. So I think this mixture of veteran talent, guys who have been in the league, along with some high upside young guys, is actually pretty good. I like the D-line for the Bears.
Interesting. So Tonga and Gibson, Travis Gibson, among the 22 that remain from the Ryan Pace regime. 77 at the beginning of the year, down to 22. That is, that is some serious trimming. Is that even more violent than you suspected it might be?
No. Because I keep going back to how much we were screaming at the roster at times the last couple of years and just not liking certain guys in certain areas. So it does not surprise me that a new general manager came in and wanted to clean house. Honestly, really the only guy that I look at that's out the door that I still really feel like could be helpful, but it was sort of a one-way deal because you got to have two sides to bring a player back, and that's Allen Robinson. Like, I still look at the wide receivers and I go, Allen Robinson could help this team, but we all know how that played out. We all understand why Allen Robinson would much rather be on the Los Angeles Rams, who just won a Super Bowl, than here, so you can't really blame him for that. All these other guys, obviously Khalil Mack's a good player, but given where the Bears were, where his contract was, the fact they could get a second-round pick in return, like, we can go down the line. Almost all these moves made sense, a lot of sense, actually, for what Ryan Poles did. And to be in this position where you have it's not a highly talented roster. No one's saying that, but it's been how do we put it? A surprisingly pleasant preseason to watch with what is here, and the fact that they're going to have so much cap space, be at the top of the league next year in the amount of flexibility that they're going to have to add to this team. If the quarterback takes off during this transition year, the Bears could actually be in a pretty good spot by next winter.
Adam Hoge from CHGO is our guest. I said running back and D-line, top two position groups on the team. Am I off?
No, I would. I think I would agree with you. I've been bullish on the running backs. I think that they're actually one of the more underrated groups in the entire league. I don't know if they have like the top end star of some of these running backs that you might be drafting in the first round of your fantasy football league. But in terms of depth, I like what they have. I don't know that there's another position group I would put over either one of those. So yeah, I guess I agree with you.
So then what's the weakest?
I think it can – well, I'm going to give you kind of a two-part answer, okay? One is I like the starters at corner. I'm still worried about the depth at cornerback. You know, they're one injury away to Jalen Johnson or Kyler Gordon from being in a position where I'm surprised Kindle Vildor and Duke Shelley still matter as much as they do. When Speaks, you bring up the roster turnover, those are two guys that I would have said, well, I would think that they would be in part of that roster turnover. And yet they're still here and potentially playing a lot of snaps against the 49ers, in a week and a half. So I think that's concerning. And then I'd look at the wide receivers, and it's still the guys who made this team, other than Darnell Mooney, are either guys who haven't caught a lot of passes in the NFL or who basically hurt the entire preseason. Mm-hmm. I mean, the fact that Equinemius St. Brown, yeah, it looks good. It looks what he's had an okay camp and has been running around as the number 2 wide receiver the entire time. But this is a guy who doesn't have a whole lot of experience catching passes in the NFL and didn't get a ton of those in the preseason either. Velus Jones Jr., Byron Pringle, N'Keal Harry makes the team, but he's going to go to IR. These are all guys who missed time. Tajay Sharp, haven't seen him in a couple weeks. Dante Pettis missed time, did come back and it looked great the other night. But that's still a concerning group to me, just based on the availability and the fact that a lot of them are really unproven in the NFL.
You know, looking around the cuts around the league, I've been scanning for wide receivers, and there's not a lot of names that hop out to you in terms of veterans, but they really wouldn't want that anyway, would they?
Well, I got one for you.
Okay.
I got one that I would actually claim on waivers and put him on the 53 right away.
Let's see if it's the same one that Danny brought up earlier in the show. Let's go.
Tyler Johnson. Is that it?
That's the one.
Yeah. Tyler.
It makes too much sense. Everyone's going to claim that guy.
He's young enough that there's upside probably here.
There's upside. There's good tape. He's somebody I was surprised lasted to the 5th round in the 2020 draft. When he was at Minnesota and I was still doing sidelines for Northwestern, I saw him up close a couple times, and I mean, the dude just would go up and catch the football. I mean, he was a playmaker. You wonder how that transitions to the NFL. So he ends up in a place like Tampa where, okay, I don't know if that was the best showcase of his talent, yet he still made plays. He caught a touchdown in the playoffs last year. I believe he had a nice catch against the Bears a couple of years ago, maybe even 2 when he was a rookie. So he's with Tom Brady. Tom Brady likes his guys. You got to be a Tom Brady guy, right, to really shine there. I think it's a situation where a change of scenery and a bigger opportunity can really be good for Tyler Johnson. I can't think of a better opportunity than Chicago Bears, which I just told you, all the guys are either hurt or haven't done anything in the NFL. So bring him on board, see what he can do. But to your point, a lot of guys are going to want him. So you hope that the Bears, I think they're 7th in the waiver order, where that can maybe pay off because they are towards the top.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask. This process, some of the vested veterans that got cut, they don't have to go through the waiver process. They can go anywhere they want. But guys who are younger, like Tyler Johnson, they get cut, and the Bears are 7th. The teams are ahead of them. I wonder if there's wide receiver hungry teams ahead of them.
Well, they're all bad teams, and bad teams tend to not have wide receivers. So I don't necessarily have that list right in front of me, Simmons.
Yeah, but the Texans would be one of them. And they arguably have more of a wide receiver problem than the Bears. So yeah, I mean it's basically the teams that were in front of them where they would have drafted if they had a first round pick.
Come on, why don't you have that list in front of you?
Year, right?
But just remember, yes. Wide receiver needy teams, all that, but anybody you claim has to go on your 53. So you have to have a spot somewhere else to let go of someone, and you also have to factor in with wide receivers, unless it's a very specific case where he's going to an offense that's basically the same as where they came from. You got a ramping up period to go through. I mean, the guy's got to learn the playbook. He's got to know where to line up, what routes to run, and how the whole system works. So even if the Bears were to bring Tyler Johnson on, I don't know that he's active week 1, and some teams are going to be more tolerable to that idea than others.
Jaguars, Lions, Texans, Jets, Giants, Panthers, then Bears in terms of the waiver claims.
Yeah, so there's a lot of bad teams with a lot of needs up there. Adam Hoge with us from CHGO Sports. You feel confident you know the starting offensive line left to right against the Niners?
Yeah, I think so. I guess there's still a possibility that that some moves can be made. Not to freak out, but I'm just staring at the Bears website with the depth chart, and Tevin Jenkins just disappeared. So maybe that's just a glitch, but that's
disappeared
from the depth chart.
He's not. It literally just refreshed on my screen, and he's not there. So anyway, but I don't know. But to answer your question, I mean, I think that's still the one question that remains, because for some reason the trade rumors continue to get thrown out there by some of the national insiders, whereas I think here in Chicago we're all looking at Tevin Jenkins. And by the way, now I see he just popped up at right tackle, so they're probably just messing with it on the back end. But I feel, to answer your question, I feel pretty confident that he's the Bears starting right guard at week 1.
Wow.
And we couldn't do nothing about it.
Oh, no. Don't go preemptive.
And now he's back.
Goodfellas tournament. He's back.
Tanny had the Goodfellas treatment ready for Tevin Jenkins the day after the draft. Okay? So, all right. So you think you have it then as what we've seen, right? Braxton Jones, Cody Whitehair, and then you are assuming Lucas Patrick starts at center and is healthy. And then you're saying Tevin Jenkins, Larry Borum, with Riley Reif hoping to get enough starts to trigger in the 10% playing time clause in his contract, but not a week 1 starter.
Well, and then you got to look at the other side of that, which is if you're the Bears, isn't that incentive to play the younger guy who's played well enough to start over him at this point, right? You want to hold off those Riley Reif playing time bonuses if you can. Obviously, if it's necessary to play them, then you play them. But that, I think, factors into the equation a little bit, too. And look, and one of the things I've talked a lot about with this new regime and this coaching staff that's been really refreshing is just how they seem to do things that make sense. So considering that these 5 guys the last couple weeks have looked good while they've been out there, it makes sense to keep them as the starters. And that's well, when I say these 5, obviously Lucas Patrick hasn't been out there, but I'm inserting him as the guy you signed in the offseason, and we'll plug in there for week 1, assuming he's healthy. That's just what makes sense. And I think that checks out with what this coaching staff has done so far in the preseason.
Yeah, it's interesting. We'll see what happens. The depth chart that's up on ChicagoBears.com is from the 22nd of August, but we're all expecting a new one to be populated at any moment here. In terms of the running backs, Adam, 2 fullbacks listed, but one of them, it was a tight end in college, right? So, and the only 2 tight ends there. So is this one of those H-back situations where Jake Tonjes will be used at tight end and occasionally as a fullback if need be?
Well, that is certainly tight end is an area where I wonder if there's still some movement that happens, because the main reason is there's this is an offense going to have a lot of 2 tight end sets. There's going to be a lot of personnel groupings where you have both tight ends on the field, and all it takes is one guy to get hurt. You got to have a backup. So that's why I wonder if there's an addition coming. Jake Tonjes, just for the record, so people understand, has been primarily working as a fullback for most of camp. So when I say like they go to individual drills, he's with the running backs and Kari Blasingame as another fullback. He's not with the tight ends. And so, yes, he played tight end. He can potentially split time at both, and I think maybe that's, at least as it stands right now, how it probably shakes out. But to me, he's really been developed as a fullback in camp, and they like him. So I'm still wondering who's really going to be that true third tight end. And I wonder if, a lot of times, remember, N'Keal Harry, so he's probably going to go to IR. You bring somebody back. So is that like James O'Shaughnessy potentially coming back to the roster? They have to make room for 24 hours to make that type of space. Just keep that in mind as the roster continues to change over the next couple days.